The Nexari Council chamber fell silent as High Minister Zethrin reviewed the latest diplomatic failure. 3 trade agreements collapsed, 2 alliance negotiations ended in mutual insult, and 1 minor species had threatened war over what should have been a simple border discussion. The holographic display showed red markers across 7 different star systems, each one representing a relationship the Nexari had somehow managed to damage in the past standard cycle. "We are the oldest civilization in this sector," Zethrin said to his assembled advisors. "We have technologies that younger species cannot comprehend. Our cities stretch across moons, and our ships travel between stars like droplets of water falling through air. And yet we cannot seem to speak to other species without causing offense." His primary advisor, a thin Nexari female named Velsha, shifted her 4 arms in what humans would later learn was the Nexari equivalent of a nervous shrug. The Dorvani ambassador demanded we apologize for offering him the wrong temperature of greeting beverage. The Kurathi delegation walked out when our representative failed to acknowledge their military victories from 600 years ago, and the Morthans are still angry about the seating arrangement at last year's summit. Zethrin's faceplates tightened in frustration. The Nexari had evolved on a world of mathematical precision. Their language was logical, their culture was based on efficiency, and their social interactions followed clear rules that any Nexari child could understand. But the galaxy was filled with species whose behavior seemed random, emotional, and completely unpredictable. "What do we know about successful diplomatic species?" Zethrin asked. "Surely there must be someone in the galactic community who excels at this art." Velsha activated another display. Data scrolled across the screen, showing diplomatic success rates for various species across the sector. Most hovered around 30 to 40% positive outcomes. The Nexari sat at an embarrassing 12%. But one species stood out with a rating that made the entire council lean forward in surprise. "The humans," Velsha said, "a young species from a small world called Earth. They have only been active in galactic affairs for 200 of their years. Their technology is unremarkable. Their military is modest. Their economy is developing but not exceptional. And yet their diplomatic success rate is 91%. The chamber filled with murmurs. 91% was almost impossible. No species in recorded history had achieved such consistent diplomatic success. "There must be an error," said one of the junior ministers. "I have verified the data 7 times, Velsha replied. "The humans have negotiated trade agreements with the isolationist Fenari, who had refused contact with outsiders for 3,000 years. They resolved a territorial dispute between the Croshan Dominion and the Stellar Collective that had lasted for centuries. They even managed to establish peaceful relations with the Vex Swarm, a species that had never communicated with non-hive minds before." Zethrin studied the data with growing interest. "How do they accomplish this?" "I do not know," Velsha admitted. "Their methods are not well documented. What little information exists suggests they use something they call empathy, though the exact meaning of this term is unclear. They also appear to employ concepts like compromise, cultural sensitivity, and something called reading the room." "Reading the room," Zethrin repeated. "Is this some kind of scanning technology?" "Unknown. But, Minister, there is a solution available to us. The humans have a practice of providing diplomatic advisors to allied governments. For a reasonable fee and a mutual cooperation agreement, they will send trained professionals to assist with negotiations and diplomatic training." Zethrin considered this carefully. The Nexari had never asked for help from a younger species. It went against their cultural pride as one of the ancient civilizations of the galaxy, but pride had not prevented their diplomatic failures. Pride had not saved the Dorvani trade agreement or kept the Kurathi at the negotiating table. "Prepare a formal request," Zethrin said finally. "We will ask the humans for their finest diplomatic advisors. Whatever their methods, we must learn them." The request traveled through official channels and reached Earth 3 weeks later. At the Human Diplomatic Corps headquarters in Geneva, Director Elena Vasquez read the Nexari petition with barely contained excitement. "The Nexari want our help," she said to her senior staff. "The actual Nexari, one of the founding civilizations of the Galactic Forum, they're asking for diplomatic advisors." Her deputy, Marcus Chen, whistled softly. "That's huge. The Nexari have never accepted assistance from anyone. Their reputation is built on self-sufficiency. Their reputation is also built on accidentally insulting everyone they talk to," said another officer, Sarah Williams. "I worked with a Nexari trade delegation last year. Lovely people, genuinely well-meaning, but they told the Fenoran ambassador that his species' ritual greetings were statistically inefficient. The Fenoran almost declared war." Elena nodded. "That's why this is such an important opportunity. If we can help the Nexari improve their diplomatic relations, it changes the entire dynamic of this sector. They have resources, technology, and influence that could benefit everyone. They just need help connecting with people." She looked around the room at her team. The Human Diplomatic Corps was the youngest major diplomatic organization in the galaxy, but it had achieved remarkable results. Some aliens joked that humans could make friends with rocks, though humans knew that the reality was more complex. Their success came from centuries of learning to navigate differences on their own divided world before ever reaching the stars. "I want to send our best team," Elena said. "This is a long-term assignment. The Nexari need more than a quick fix. They need to understand the fundamental principles of cross-cultural communication." Marcus pulled up personnel files on his datapad. "I recommend James Morrison as lead advisor. 20 years of experience, fluent in 11 alien languages, and he's worked with logic-based cultures before. He helped negotiate the Venlari Accords." "Add Lisa Tanaka," Sarah suggested. "She specializes in cultural translation and non-verbal communication. If anyone can teach the Nexari to read social cues, it's her." Elena agreed and added 2 more names to the list. David Okafor, an expert in conflict resolution who had helped end 3 civil wars before joining the Galactic Service, and Chen Weilin, a young prodigy who had an almost supernatural ability to understand what people actually wanted versus what they said they wanted. The team was assembled within 2 weeks. They received their briefing materials, studied everything available about Nexari culture and history, and prepared themselves for what would likely be the most challenging diplomatic assignment of their careers. When their ship approached the Nexari home system, James Morrison stood at the observation deck and watched the massive orbital structures come into view. The Nexari had built their civilization on a scale that was hard for humans to comprehend. Their space stations were the size of moons. Their construction projects spanned solar systems. "Impressive," Lisa said, standing beside him. "They've accomplished so much. I wonder why communication is so hard for them." James had been thinking about that question for the entire journey. They evolved differently than most species. From what I've read, the Nexari developed from a hive-like organism that communicated through precise chemical signals. Every message meant exactly one thing. There was no room for interpretation, no need to guess what someone meant. Over millions of years, they developed individual consciousness and complex society, but they kept that precision in their communication. So when they encounter species that use ambiguous language and social subtext, Lisa said, they literally don't understand what's happening. Exactly. Imagine trying to read poetry when you've only ever experienced mathematical equations. The words might be the same, but the meaning is invisible. The ship docked at the orbital receiving station, and the human team was greeted by a formal delegation of Nexari officials. High Minister Zethrin himself had come to welcome them, a sign of how seriously the Nexari government was taking this initiative. "Welcome to Nexari space," Zethrin said. His translation device rendered his words in flat, emotionless English. "We are grateful for your response to our request. The success rate of human diplomacy is statistically remarkable. We wish to understand the mechanisms behind this success." James stepped forward and offered a warm smile. He knew the Nexari wouldn't understand the expression, but it felt natural to offer it anyway. "Thank you for this opportunity, High Minister. We're honored to work with your government. I think we can help each other a great deal." Zethran's face plates shifted slightly, a movement that James had learned indicated confusion. "Help each other. We did not request mutual assistance. We requested advisory services for which we are providing appropriate compensation." James glanced at Lisa, who gave him a tiny nod of encouragement. This was going to be an interesting assignment. "Of course," James said smoothly. "I only meant that we look forward to learning about your remarkable civilization while we share our diplomatic experiences. Every relationship is an exchange, and we value what we can learn from the Nexari just as much as what we can offer." Zethran considered this for a moment. The concept of valuing non-material exchanges was unfamiliar, but there was something in the human's tone that was somehow pleasant. "Acceptable," he said. "Your quarters have been prepared. We will begin formal consultations tomorrow." As the Nexari delegation led them through the gleaming corridors of the station, James felt the weight of their task settle on his shoulders. Teaching diplomacy to a species that didn't understand subtext was going to be the challenge of a lifetime. But as he watched his team interact with their hosts, already asking questions and showing genuine interest in their surroundings, he felt confident. Humans had been bridging divides since before they left their home planet. This was just one more bridge to build. The formal consultations began the next morning in a conference room that seemed designed to intimidate. The ceiling rose 30 meters above the floor, covered in geometric patterns that shifted and changed according to some algorithm James couldn't identify. The chairs were designed for Nexari bodies, which meant the humans had to sit on raised platforms to reach the table properly. High Minister Zethran sat at the head of the table, surrounded by 12 of his senior advisors. Each one represented a different department of the Nexari government, from trade to military to cultural affairs. They sat in perfect stillness, watching the humans with expressions that gave nothing away. James had prepared for this moment. He stood and activated a small holographic projector that displayed a simple diagram. "Before we begin specific training," he said, "I think it's important that we establish a shared understanding of what diplomacy actually is. High Minister, how would you define successful diplomacy?" Zethran answered without hesitation. "Diplomacy is the process of reaching optimal agreements between parties through the clear communication of positions and the application of logical negotiation frameworks." James nodded. "That's a reasonable definition, and it's not wrong, but I'd like to suggest a slightly different perspective. Diplomacy is the art of building relationships between beings who see the universe differently. It's not just about what you say, but how you make the other party feel while you're saying it." The Nexari exchanged glances. Velsha spoke up. "Feelings are internal emotional states. They are not factors in logical negotiation." "With respect," Lisa said gently, "that assumption is exactly why your diplomatic success rate is so low. For most species in the galaxy, feelings are not just factors in negotiation. They are the primary factors. An agreement that makes logical sense but makes one party feel disrespected will fail. A proposal that is slightly suboptimal but makes everyone feel valued will succeed." David leaned forward. "Let me give you an example. 2 years ago, we negotiated a resource-sharing agreement between the Fenoran Collective and the Halashi Republic. The terms were almost identical to an agreement the Nexari had proposed 10 years earlier, which had been rejected. Do you know why our proposal succeeded when yours failed?" Zethran's face plates shifted in what James recognized as intense interest. We have analyzed that failure extensively. The terms were fair and equitable. The resource distribution followed optimal efficiency models. We found no logical reason for the rejection. The Fëanórin rejected your proposal because your negotiator told them that their traditional territorial claims were irrational, David explained. That statement was probably true from a logical standpoint. The Fëanórin claims were based on ancient religious beliefs rather than practical considerations. But those beliefs were deeply important to the Fëanórin people. By calling them irrational, your negotiator told the Fëanórin that their culture didn't matter. But their claims were irrational, one of the Nexari advisors protested. We were simply stating a fact. Wylin, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. There's a difference between facts and useful truths. Yes, the Fëanórin territorial claims weren't based on logic, but pointing that out served no purpose except to make them feel that you didn't understand or respect them. Our negotiator acknowledged their traditional claims, expressed appreciation for their cultural heritage, and then worked with them to find practical solutions that honored both their traditions and their actual needs. Zethrin was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. You are telling us that successful diplomacy requires saying things that are not strictly accurate in order to manage emotional responses. James shook his head. No, not at all. We never lie in diplomatic negotiations. What we do is choose which truths to emphasize and how to present them. Everything our negotiator told the Fëanórin was true. Their traditions were worthy of respect. Their cultural heritage was valuable, and practical solutions could honor both their beliefs and their needs. All of those statements were accurate. We simply chose to focus on truths that built connection rather than truths that created division. The concept was clearly difficult for the Nexari to grasp. Their entire civilization was built on the idea that truth was truth, and all accurate statements had equal value. The notion that some truths were more useful than others in specific contexts was almost revolutionary. James looked around the room at the confused and skeptical Nexari faces. He realized that this would take time and that progress would come slowly, but he also felt a spark of hope. The Nexari were listening. They were trying to understand, and in James's experience, that willingness to learn was the first step toward real change. Perhaps, James suggested, we should start with a practical exercise. I'd like to observe some of your diplomatic interactions and offer feedback. Would you be open to that? Zethrin conferred briefly with his advisors before responding. We have a scheduled meeting tomorrow with representatives of the Thulani Federation. They are requesting modifications to an existing trade agreement. You may observe and provide analysis afterward. James smiled, though he knew the expression meant nothing to his hosts. Perfect. That's exactly the kind of opportunity we need. As the meeting concluded and the Nexari filed out of the conference room, Lisa caught James's arm. That went better than I expected, she said quietly. They're actually considering what we're saying. They're considering it, James agreed. But understanding it is going to be much harder. We're not just teaching them new techniques. We're asking them to see the universe in a completely different way. Lisa nodded. But they asked for our help. That means somewhere deep down they know their old approach isn't working. That's the opening we need. James watched the Nexari disappear down the corridor, their perfect posture and measured steps a physical reflection of their precise, logical culture. Somewhere in there, he believed, was the capacity for the kind of intuitive connection that made diplomacy an art rather than a science. He just had to help them find it. The Thulani delegation arrived exactly on schedule. The Thulani were a humanoid species with blue-gray skin and large, expressive eyes. They were known throughout the sector as emotional beings who valued personal relationships above almost everything else. Their ships were decorated with artwork. Their diplomatic meetings traditionally began with the sharing of stories about each delegate's family and home. James watched from an observation gallery as the Nexari lead negotiator, a precise female named Crystal, greeted the Thulani ambassadors. He had a datapad ready to take notes, though he already suspected he knew how this was going to go. "Welcome," Crystal said flatly. "The Nexari government acknowledges receipt of your request for trade agreement modifications. We have prepared a comprehensive analysis of the proposed changes and their impacts on resource allocation efficiency." The lead Thulani ambassador, a warm-faced male named Bilar, smiled hopefully. "Thank you for receiving us. Before we begin formal discussions, I had hoped we might share news from our homes. How has the harvest season treated your agricultural sectors? On Thula Prime, we just celebrated the festival of first fruits, and my daughter performed the traditional blessing for the first time." Crystal's face plates remained still. "I am not involved in agricultural administration. The status of harvest seasons is not relevant to trade agreement modifications. Shall we proceed to the agenda?" James winced. He could see Bilar's smile falter, his large eyes dimming with disappointment. The Thulani had just offered a gift of personal connection, the most valuable thing in their culture, and Crystal had rejected it as irrelevant. The negotiation continued for 3 hours. The terms the Nexari offered were actually quite fair, perhaps even generous by some measures. But Bilar's responses grew shorter and more formal as the meeting progressed. Every time he tried to inject personal warmth into the conversation, Crystal redirected back to data and analysis. By the end, the Thulani agreed to take the proposal back to their government for consideration. Their tone suggested they would recommend rejection. When the Thulani had departed, James and his team met with Crystal in the same conference room they had used the day before. "The proposal was logical and well-constructed," Crystal said. "Yet the Thulani response was negative. I do not understand why they would reject favorable terms." James pulled up a recording of the meeting's opening moments. "Watch the Thulani ambassador's face when you declined to discuss the harvest and his daughter's ceremony. Observe the recording with careful attention. His expression changes, the corners of his mouth lower and his eyes contract. Is this significant?" "That expression indicates hurt feelings," Lisa explained. "Ambassador Bilar was trying to establish a personal connection with you. In Thulani culture, personal relationships are the foundation of all business dealings. When you dismissed his family news as irrelevant, you told him that you didn't value him as a person, only as a resource." "But I do not know this individual," Crystal protested. "We have no personal relationship. The discussion of his daughter's ceremony could not have affected the terms of the trade agreement." Wyland stepped in. "That's true in a narrow sense, but the discussion would have affected something more important. It would have affected how Ambassador Bilar felt about you and by extension about the Nexari government. If he felt that you valued him as a person, he would have approached the negotiation with trust and goodwill. Instead, he felt that you saw him only as an obstacle to your objectives." Was silent for a long moment. "You are saying that time spent on irrelevant personal discussion would have produced better results than time spent on the actual substance of the negotiation?" "Yes," James said simply. "For the Thulani, personal connection is not irrelevant. It is the most relevant thing. A Thulani will accept worse terms from someone they trust and like than better terms from someone who makes them feel like a number on a datasheet." The concept clearly troubled Crystal. This seems deeply inefficient. How can one conduct business if every interaction requires extensive personal engagement? David smiled. "It's actually more efficient in the long run. Think about it this way. You've been trying to modify this trade agreement with the Thulani for how long?" Crystal checked her records. 3 standard years. They have rejected 4 previous proposals. "And how many hours have been spent preparing those proposals, conducting those negotiations, analyzing the failures?" "Several thousand hours across multiple departments." Now imagine if your first negotiator had spent 2 hours listening to stories about the Thulani ambassador's family and sharing similar stories from Nexari life. Those 2 hours of what you call inefficiency might have produced a successful agreement 3 years ago. The real inefficiency is the thousands of hours wasted on logical proposals that failed because they ignored emotional needs. The room fell silent as the Nexari processed this perspective. James could almost see the mental frameworks shifting behind Crystal's eyes. The Nexari were brilliant logical thinkers. They were fully capable of understanding this argument once it was presented in terms they could analyze. "I require time to consider this information," Crystal said finally. "May I request a second meeting with the Thulani delegation? I would like to attempt a different approach." James felt a surge of hope. "Of course, and we'll help you prepare. We can practice the kind of personal conversation that works well with the Thulani culture." Over the next several days, the human team worked intensively with Crystal and several other Nexari diplomats. They ran simulations and role-played negotiations with each other. The humans taught the Nexari to recognize emotional expressions and to respond to them appropriately. They explained the concept of active listening, of asking follow-up questions that showed genuine interest rather than immediately steering conversations back to business objectives. It was challenging work. The Nexari struggled with concepts that humans learned in childhood, but they were dedicated students, analyzing each new social skill with the same rigorous attention they applied to engineering problems. When Balar and his delegation returned for the second meeting, they were greeted by a transformed Crystal. She still spoke with the precise diction of a Nexari, but her opening words were different. "Ambassador Balar," she said, "I understand that your daughter recently performed an important ceremony for your people. I would be honored to hear about this experience. The Nexari do not have equivalent traditions, but we value the bonds between generations." Balar's large eyes widened in surprise and then warmed with genuine pleasure. "You remember? Yes, my daughter Tella performed the blessing of first fruits. She was nervous, but she spoke the words beautifully. Her grandmother wept with pride." What followed was 20 minutes of conversation about families, traditions, and the things that mattered most to the people in the room. Crystal listened with careful attention, asked thoughtful questions, and even shared stories about Nexari coming-of-age traditions that she had researched specifically for this occasion. By the time the actual trade agreement came up, the atmosphere in the room had completely changed. The Thulani were relaxed and engaged. They offered creative suggestions for modifications that addressed concerns Crystal hadn't even raised yet. The negotiation that had failed 4 times over 3 years was successfully concluded in a single afternoon. Watching from the observation gallery, James felt a warm satisfaction spreading through his chest. This was why he loved his work. Not the political victories or the career advancement, but moments like this, when beings who had struggled to understand each other finally found common ground. "It's working," Lisa whispered beside him. "They're actually learning." James nodded. "One diplomat at a time, and each one will teach others. That's how cultures change." He didn't know it yet, but the changes had only begun. News of the successful Thulani negotiation spread quickly through the Nexari government. Within weeks, requests for diplomatic training flooded the human advisory team. Ministers who had dismissed the program as a waste of resources now competed for training slots. The concept of emotional intelligence, once dismissed as primitive irrationality, became a topic of serious academic study. High Minister Zethrin called a special meeting 3 months into the program. The human team gathered in his private chambers, a more intimate setting than the formal conference rooms they had used before. "I have been reviewing the diplomatic outcomes since your arrival," Zethrin said. His voice carried an unusual quality that James had learned to recognize as Nexari excitement. "Our success rate has improved from 12% to 47%. In 3 months. Lisa smiled. That's wonderful progress, High Minister. Your diplomats have been exceptional students. They tell me that the methods feel strange at first, Zethrin continued. Counterintuitive, but several have reported that they are beginning to understand not just the techniques but the reasons behind them. He paused, his face plates shifting in a way James had never seen before. I find myself curious about something. Why do humans excel at this? Your species is young. Your civilization is small. How did you develop these abilities? James had been expecting this question. He had thought about it many times during his career, trying to understand what made humans different from other species when it came to building connections across differences. I think it's because of how our world works, James said carefully. Earth is a diverse planet. Before we developed advanced technology, humans were divided into thousands of different cultures, each with their own languages, beliefs, and customs. We spent most of our history trying to communicate across those differences, often failing catastrophically, but sometimes succeeding brilliantly. David picked up the thread. We had no choice but to learn. On many worlds, a single dominant culture eventually spreads across the entire planet, but Earth's geography kept us divided. Mountains, oceans, deserts, all of these barriers meant that human cultures developed in isolation and then had to find ways to work together despite their differences. We made many mistakes along the way, Wylin added. Our history is filled with conflicts caused by failures of understanding, but each failure taught us something. Over thousands of years, we developed practices and principles for bridging divides. By the time we reached the stars, cross-cultural communication had become one of our most studied and practiced skills. Zethrin considered this history with visible interest. So, your diplomatic abilities are not a natural gift, but a learned adaptation to environmental pressures. Exactly, James said. Which means they can be taught. The Nexari evolved in a different environment, but you have the intelligence and dedication to learn these skills just as humans did. It might take longer because you're starting from a different baseline, but there's no fundamental reason why Nexari can't become excellent diplomats. There is something else, Zethrin said slowly. I have observed your team working together. You communicate efficiently, but there is something more than efficiency. When one of you speaks, the others listen in a particular way. You seem to anticipate each other's thoughts. What is this phenomenon? Lisa and James exchanged a look that carried an entire conversation in a single glance. We call it rapport, Lisa said. It develops when people spend time together and genuinely care about each other. You start to understand how the other person thinks and feels. You pick up on small signals that outsiders might miss. This rapport, Zethrin said, it exists between your team members because you share experiences and mutual care. Yes. Could it exist between a Nexari and a human? The question hung in the air. James felt the significance of it. Zethrin wasn't just asking about diplomatic technique anymore. He was asking about genuine connection across species boundaries. I believe it could, James said softly. Rapport requires time, openness, and genuine interest in another person's experience. Species doesn't matter if those elements are present. Zethrin was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, less formal, almost hesitant. I have governed my people for 37 years. In that time, I have made many decisions affecting billions of lives, but I have never had a conversation like this one. A conversation where I felt that the other parties saw me as something more than a position or a problem to solve. That's what we're trying to teach, David said gently. That everyone, regardless of species or status, wants to be seen and valued for who they are. When you offer that recognition to others, they respond with trust and cooperation. When you withhold it, you may achieve short-term goals, but you lose the relationship. Zethrin stood and moved to a window that looked out over his capital city. The view was spectacular, enormous structures of metal and crystal stretching to the horizon, a civilization that had endured for longer than humans had existed as a species. "We built all of this," Zethrin said, "through logic and efficiency. We spread across the stars through technological superiority. We believed that our methods were optimal, that emotional considerations were primitive obstacles to be minimized." He turned back to face the humans. "We were wrong. We built a civilization that can reshape planets, but we could not convince a Thulani ambassador to sign a trade agreement." James joined him at the window. "You weren't wrong about everything. Your technological achievements are genuinely remarkable. Your logical frameworks have value in many contexts. What you were missing was just one piece of a larger picture: the ability to connect with beings who process the universe differently than you do. And you are teaching us this ability." "We're trying, but I want to be honest with you, High Minister. We're not perfect either. Humans have made terrible mistakes in our relations with other species. We've misunderstood cultures and caused offense. We've let our own biases blind us to perspectives we should have considered. The difference is that we've learned to recognize these failures and correct them." Zethrin's face plates shifted into an expression James had never seen before. It took him a moment to recognize it as something close to a smile. "Then, we are both imperfect species, trying to improve ourselves through mutual learning." "Yes," James said, returning the smile. "I think that's exactly what we are." The conversation marked a turning point in the relationship between the human advisors and the Nexari government. What had begun as a formal consulting arrangement began to evolve into something deeper, a genuine partnership between two very different civilizations, each learning from the other. Over the following months, the changes continued to accelerate. Nexari diplomats who had completed training began mentoring their colleagues. Academic institutions developed courses in emotional intelligence and cross-cultural communication. Artists began creating works that explored themes of connection and understanding, a new movement that critics called the empathy renaissance. But the most significant changes happened on a smaller scale, in individual interactions that slowly shifted the fabric of Nexari society. A Nexari scientist learned to acknowledge her colleagues' contributions before pointing out errors in their work. A Nexari parent learned to ask about his children's feelings rather than just their academic performance. A Nexari merchant learned that remembering customers' names and preferences could build loyalty more effectively than competitive pricing. James and his team traveled throughout Nexari space, conducting training sessions and observing the changes taking hold. Everywhere they went, they found Nexari who were struggling with new concepts but determined to master them. The logical precision that defined Nexari culture became an advantage once it was properly directed. They analyzed social interactions with the same rigor they applied to scientific problems, developing systematic approaches to building rapport and recognizing emotional cues. 1 year into the program, the Nexari diplomatic success rate had climbed to 73%. More importantly, the nature of their relationships with other species had fundamentally changed. Instead of being tolerated as a powerful but difficult partner, the Nexari were becoming sought after as mediators and advisors in their own right. "We are becoming what you are," Zethrin told James during one of their regular meetings. "Bridge builders." James shook his head. "You're becoming what you always had the potential to be. We just helped you see possibilities you hadn't considered." "This is diplomacy," Zethrin observed with something like wonder. "You are managing my emotional response to encourage further engagement and cooperation." James laughed. "Maybe a little, but I also genuinely mean it. The Nexari are remarkable. You've achieved things no other species has achieved. Now you're achieving something even harder. You're changing your own culture, deliberately and thoughtfully, to become better partners to the rest of the galaxy." "It is strange," Zethrin admitted. "I have begun to enjoy conversations for their own sake, not as vehicles for information transfer, but as experiences to be valued. I look forward to our meetings not because of the practical outcomes, but because I find your company pleasant." That's called friendship, James said quietly, and I feel the same way. Zethran's face plates shifted into that almost smile again. Friendship, between a Nexari high minister and a human diplomat. My predecessors would have considered such a concept absurd. Maybe, but your successors will consider it natural. The Galactic Forum Summit approached, the largest diplomatic gathering in the sector. Representatives from over 200 species would come together to discuss trade, security, and cooperation. For decades, the Nexari had attended these summits as observers rather than active participants, knowing that their diplomatic failures made meaningful engagement impossible. This year would be different. High Minister Zethran personally requested that the Human Advisory Team accompany the Nexari delegation. They spent weeks preparing, reviewing the cultural backgrounds of every major species that would attend, practicing difficult conversations, and planning strategies for building new relationships. When the Nexari delegation arrived at the forum station, the other species watched with curiosity. Word had spread about the changes in Nexari diplomatic behavior. Some were skeptical, others were hopeful. All were interested to see what the ancient civilization would do differently. Zethran gave the opening address of the summit. His words had been carefully prepared, incorporating everything he had learned over the past year. Fellow citizens of the galaxy, he began, for many years the Nexari have approached these gatherings with a single goal, to advance our interests through the application of logical principles. We believed that if our proposals were sound, other species would naturally accept them. When they did not, we concluded that the problem lay with their irrationality rather than with our approach. A murmur ran through the assembly. This was not the formal, detached Nexari rhetoric they were accustomed to hearing. We were wrong, Zethran continued. Not about the value of logic, but about the nature of cooperation. We failed to understand that building lasting partnerships requires more than good proposals. It requires trust, understanding, the recognition that each species brings unique perspectives and values to the galactic community. He paused, and James saw something he had never expected to see. Zethran was reading the room, sensing the audience's response and adjusting his delivery accordingly. We have spent the past year learning a new approach to diplomacy. Human advisors have taught us skills we should have developed long ago, skills in listening, in empathy, in building the personal connections that make cooperation possible. We are still learning. We will make mistakes, but we are committed to becoming the partners that the galaxy deserves. The response was unprecedented. Species that had avoided Nexari contact for generations approached the delegation with tentative interest. Old grudges were discussed openly for the first time. By the end of the summit, the Nexari had established more new relationships than they had in the previous 50 years combined. But the moment James would remember most came in the final hours of the gathering. He was standing with Zethran on an observation deck, watching the ships of 100 different species departing for their homeworlds. "Thank you," Zethran said simply, "for everything you have taught us." James shook his head. "Thank your people for having the courage to change. That's something no one can teach." "Will you stay?" Zethran asked. "Your contract expires next month. I would like to extend the advisory program, but I also understand if you wish to return to your own kind." James considered the question carefully. He had been away from Earth for over a year. His apartment, his friends, his normal life, all of it was waiting for him. But he also thought about everything he had seen in Nexari space. The changes taking root, the friendships forming, a civilization transforming itself through deliberate effort. "I'd like to stay," he said finally, "not as an advisor, as a friend." Zethran's face plates shifted into that almost smile that James had come to recognize as genuine warmth. "I would like that very much." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the ships disappear into the stars. Two very different beings from two very different worlds, connected by something that defied logical analysis, but was no less real for that. In the years that followed, the partnership between humans and Nexari became a model for interspecies cooperation throughout the galaxy. The Nexari went on to become some of the most effective mediators in diplomatic history, their logical frameworks enhanced by hard-won emotional intelligence. Human advisors continued to assist other species with diplomatic challenges, but the Nexari were often their closest partners in this work. James Morrison never returned to Earth permanently. He made visits, keeping connections with family and friends, but his home became the space between worlds, the place where different species met and learned to understand each other. He trained hundreds of diplomats, both human and alien, passing on the skills and wisdom he had accumulated over a lifetime of building bridges. When he finally retired, decades later, Zethrin hosted a celebration that drew representatives from across the galaxy. In his speech, the old High Minister said something that James would carry with him for the rest of his days. When we first requested human advisors, we thought we were hiring consultants to fix a problem. We did not understand that we were opening a door that would change everything. The humans did not just teach us techniques. They taught us how to see the universe through different eyes. They taught us that understanding others is not a weakness but a strength. They taught us that the greatest achievements are not the things we build alone, but the connections we forge together. He turned to face James directly. My friend James once told me that diplomacy is the art of building relationships between beings who see the universe differently. I have thought about those words many times over the years. I believe now that he was describing something even larger. He was describing the art of becoming more than we were, the art of growing beyond our limitations by embracing others. Zethrin raised his glass in the human gesture of respect that he had learned long ago. To the humans, he said, for showing us that the stars are not just places to reach, but neighbors to know. The gathering echoed the toast, a chorus of voices from 100 different species, united in recognition of a simple truth that humans had carried with them from their divided world to the farthest reaches of the galaxy. That understanding matters more than strength, that connection matters more than conquest, and that the greatest victories are the ones where everyone wins. James Morrison, watching his friends and former students celebrate around him, felt the warmth of a life well spent. He had traveled far from Earth, but he had never stopped doing what humans did best: building bridges, one relationship at a time.